Welcome to Black Coal Woodworking. My name's Matt. Today we're building this coffee table. I started out by drawing the top in Sketchup, and I added measurements where each piece would go. That way I wouldn't actually have to make a full square, and I could optimize my wood usage. The size of my top is about 2 feet across, or 609 millimeters. Now the way I've got it set up means I need 2 pieces of each size because I'm going to have 4 pieces on the left half of the circle and 4 on the right. I'm going to try and keep the thickness of the table around 1.5 inches thick, or 38 millimeters. Over at the jointer, I flattened the bottom and one edge of each of the pieces. I'm trying to take off as little material as possible so I can keep this top as thick as I can. Ultimately, the thickness of my top will be determined by the amount of material I remove at the jointer and at the planer. At the planer, I send the pieces through so I can make the top parallel to the bottom I just flattened. Instead of running these pieces through the table saw to get the edge parallel, I prefer to use the planer because I'm already here. Plus, once I've taken it through the table saw, I usually have to clean up the table saw marks anyway. Before gluing up, I wanted to lay out the top so that I can mark them and joint them one more time. That way I would get an extremely tight glue line for the glue up. But to do that, I stuck a nail into one of the pieces. This is the bottom side. And just using a scrap piece of wood, I cut a hole in the end of it for a pencil. That way I could kind of roughly mark out where my lines would be. This will make it easier to line up my glue joints in a few minutes. Right now I'm marking in and out joints. That way I could take them back to the jointer for that super clean glue up. Those in and out basically mean I stick one surface of the board against the fence, and then the next surface I stick away from the fence. When you put those two together, you get an extremely tight joint for your glue up. The glue up itself was pretty straightforward. The only thing I had to watch for was the order in which I glued these pieces up. I found that it was easier to glue the front half of the circle the way I normally do, and then the back half I would sort of just go in reverse order. That way I could still line up all the lines with the circle that I had made, making sure that I didn't cause any gaps in my cut later on. Laying these glue lines out in the glue up really allowed me to realize that I had made a pretty tight tolerance, so I had to be really accurate in how close these lines lined up. And for some reason, putting them together again the second time, they seem to be just a tiny bit off, but I guess really I can make up for that when I cut out the circle, just go a little bit tighter. It's probably only going to be tighter by a couple of millimeters, which might be at the most 1/8 of an inch. I know a woodworker can never have enough clamps. In this case, I actually only have 4 of these bar clamps, and so all I do is try and make equal pressure. On to the pedestal. So I cut out each of the pieces that I'm going to use to glue up the pedestal, and the pedestal is going to be made up of 3 pieces of 2x4. Now the total height of the table is going to be about 28 inches. So the pedestal itself will actually run straight to the floor and connect to the feet that way. So the height of the pedestal legs itself is going to be about 26 or so inches. And I've got shop helper number 4. Always happy to have her in the shop. I ran these pieces through the planer next. That way I can make these sides parallel to the sides I just jointed. This glue up was pretty simple. Basically put these 3 pieces together and try to make the ends line up as close as possible, and use all my bar clamps to make sure that this joint was as tight as possible. Really, the jointer and planing step here is critical to making sure that these joints were also seamless as they could be. Once the glue dried, I took the piece back over to the jointer just to make sure that that edge was as flat and square as possible, then trued it all up at the planer. The next thing I did to the pedestal was to cut it down to final width on both sides. So that final width happens to be 3 inches. I think that's around 75 millimeters. Thankfully for this job, I had shop helper number 2. Next were the feet. These are also obviously made up of 2x4. And what I did was I ended up stacking 2 pieces together in a glue up. Somehow I missed catching that on video, but what you're seeing here is me getting each individual piece ready so I can glue them up. And now that these are glued and dried, I take them also back to the joiner and again to the planer so that I've got perfect little blocks that I can carve something out of. I measured out my pattern and drew it out onto the piece of the wood and then cut them out at the bandsaw. You might notice that it looks like there's a toe that should be cut out yet as well. I ended up opting not to do that because I didn't think it looked as good. For the joinery, on the bottom of the pedestal, I cut out kind of what looks like a castle joint. The concept here is that each foot will get a tenon cut into it that should fit into here. Moving back to the top, I took it over to the bandsaw and I started to take off the bulk of the material, making sure not to come too close to my line. The goal here is that the router bit that I'm going to use is going to be wide enough to take out any remaining material. The blade I've got on my bandsaw is pretty wide. It's normally something I use for resawing, but because of the type of arc this was, it ended up working out pretty good. To make this top perfectly round, I used a scrap piece of plywood, stuck a nail through it, and entered that nail into the bottom of the top of the table, and then plunged my router through and just cut myself a circle around the whole thing. I ended up having to clamp it to my bench and then shift it around a few times just so I can get that whole process done. But because this thing is, or the whole jig is secured to the actual workpiece, it was no risk of actually losing my spot. I could have even taken it off and put it back on, but don't want to mess with stuff when it's working. I ended up cutting out the top in about 3 passes. Over at the bandsaw, I started cutting out the rest of the feet. These are the tenons that are going to fit into the pedestal. Here I'm making very sure not to go over my line. You can't put material back on. I also cut the top of the tenon down a bit just to make sure that if there is going to be any gapping, it would be covered by this foot on the pedestal. To secure the top of the table to the pedestal, I opted to create a ring of wood that would kind of act as a collar on the top of the pedestal and allow me to screw the top to that collar. And I did this because I didn't want to actually glue anything down for the top. And the 2 screws that I'm using are going to be along the length of the grain, meaning that any wood movement that will happen is going to be allowed to happen. I decided that the collar is going to be about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. That would give me enough space to get the drill into that area and put those screws in, but it's not going to be so big that it's super visible. I'm going to create mitered corners for this particular piece because I thought that would look nicer than just butting them up together. Since I'm not a fan of measuring, using the existing pieces to make the cuts is always ideal. And that's what it's going to end up looking like. I'll just end up gluing that together and then screwing that collar itself to the pedestal just like that. The pedestal itself is not going to get glued to the collar. I'm going to use 2 screws for that on the opposite sides, making sure that the grain on the top of the table can still expand. Here you can see that at least one, actually two of these pieces is too long. So I ended up giving them a quick trim and then they fit perfectly. It was a nice snug fit. In order for me to end up putting the top on, I needed to find the center of this particular piece now. So I measured it with a caliper, sketched a line there, and ended up hammering a nail into place because that was going to be the way I put the top on there. I have a hole there already from the jig I used, so I'm going to basically use that hole and now put it on top of that screw, which will center the whole thing for me. Gluing these feet was a lot of fun. Probably one of the more challenging glue ups I've done. It was quite difficult to get them all to sit in place the way I wanted them to. Plus, I'm trying to deal with the glue dry time. I think I had more than enough time here for that, but it always feels like it's high pressure. So, rushing around doesn't help either. The feet themselves fit into the joint of the pedestal quite nicely. I did have to convince some of them a little bit to get in there. The part that was really hard, though, is the clamp. These feet aren't straight at the bottom, and there's not really a decent way to clamp that. Although, thinking about it now, I'm sure I could have found better ways. Using a level, though, I made sure it was nice and straight before we ended up letting the glue dry. For the finishing, I'm using one of my favorite finishes, which is boiled linseed oil and a bunch of ash from our fireplace. And the way I do this, oh, look at that, shop helper number 5 is there too. Love it. This is actually a really simple finish, which involves making sure that the ash you're using is ground up really fine, and then getting that, well, in this case, toilet paper covered in oil, dipping it into the ash, and then rubbing it all over the piece. And once you've done that, you can take a clean rag or toilet paper in my case and rub off all the excess finish. And then once you've done that, you get a real kind of smooth finish. When I use this kind of finish, sometimes I'm never sure quite what color it will end up being. We have a few other pieces of furniture in our house now with this finish. Most of them look very similar. This one ended up looking a little more dull at first, and then I ended up going over the whole finish again with another coat of boiled linseed oil and not any more of the actual ash. And that ended up bringing that color back to life. As I'm doing the top, my main goal here is to make sure that ash gets spread everywhere I can. And I just go in every direction so that it gets as even coat as possible. And then the fun part is when all that's done and you take that clean, whatever you're using, and you get that all the excess rubbed off, and it starts to really show you what that end product's going to look like. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing if I've earned it. And here's the final product. I did put a coat of wax on to seal the wood. I think this project turned out really well. It's actually quite a fun thing to build. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.